interest of time, I'm keeping my introduction short, but I'll just go ahead and introduce everybody together before we start. Nearest me, Dr. Vitaly Chernetsky, Slavic Languages and Literatures. Next to him, Dr. Valeriy Khan, who is with the Institute of History at the Uzbekistan Academy of Sciences. Dr. Sharon O'Brien, Global and International Studies. And then last, Mariya Omelicheva in Political Science. And they've done me the service of arranging themselves in the order of speaking. So I'm going to go ahead and turn them loose. Go ahead.
So do you want me to sit down or use the
Whichever you'd like.
All right, well,
Whichever.
okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and for giving us the opportunity to share with you some of our thoughts and perspectives of how several different scholarly disciplines can inform us in help us provide better, gain better understanding of what has been happening in and around Ukraine for the past now more than 4 months. I wear several hats here because the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Cultures teaches several aspects of the region. So I will try to talk about these several related disciplines. So we have the question of language and linguistics and language policies. We have the questions of literatures and how does literature in its history, in its current function as a social institution, how does it inform the creation and development of national, regional, and other identities, and how do these identities engage with one another? Within the broader cultural sphere, one of my major research interests is film. In fact, I teach a course on Soviet and post-Soviet cinema this semester, so I will also say a few words about how cinema as an institution also impacts the situation. So, first of all, language and linguistics. As we know, hopefully all of us here, Ukraine is an incredibly diverse country. In fact, there have been several blog posts and research publications coming in recent months which sought to counter the what seemed to be a dominant trend at some point in the mass media when people were saying that Ukraine is a divided country because people are too different. And I think the first person to strongly counter that was Dr. William Blacker, a Scotsman, who said that Ukraine in fact is not divided but diverse. And diversity is something that is usually seen as a source of strength when we talk about most countries around the world. And it is a bit of a double standard then that Western media celebrates diversity in a lot of other countries, but in the case of Ukraine, the dominant discourse was that it is a divided country. It is not a divided country, it is indeed a diverse country. It is diverse in many respects. It is diverse in terms of people's ethnic backgrounds. It is diverse in terms of the preference of mother tongue use and engagement between languages. Most importantly, of course, Ukraine has its state language Ukrainian, but it is also historically has had a long history of interaction with a big neighbor to the northeast, namely Russia. And the Russian language has also had historically a very strong presence in Ukraine. My own family is an example. My grandparents were Ukrainian speaking. My parents, who moved to the city and received education in the sciences in the 50s and the 60s, had no option of receiving their sciences education. I mean, my parents are computer scientists by training in Ukrainian, and they made a conscious choice and switched to Russian. However, in my case, since my grandparents helped raise me, I received Ukrainian nursery rhymes and lullabies and fairy tales, and my parents really encouraged me to read books in both languages. As a result, I always felt that I was comfortable with the use of both languages, and as somebody who studies culture and theory, it later helped me to do something what people call an autoethnography. When I moved to Moscow as an undergraduate, I felt that I was multiply othered by the capital of the then still existing Soviet Empire as somebody coming from Ukraine. When we talk about the language situation in Ukraine, several facts are key for our understanding. Ukrainian and Russian are two languages from the family of Slavic languages. They are fairly closely related. The good comparison would be, for example, Spanish and Portuguese. But just as we know that Spanish and Portuguese are not the same language, Ukrainian and Russian are not the same language. What happened in the situation of the Soviet Union is all Ukrainians had to learn Russian. However, Russians who have not been exposed to Ukrainian have strong trouble understanding it, and Ukrainians in the Ukrainian diaspora living in places such as Brazil or Argentina or United States or Canada who have not been exposed to Russian have trouble understanding Russian. So the language is actually quite distinct. However, the history of the engagement has been long and complex. And so here we need to look back for several centuries. And when we're looking at the state of Kievan Rus, we can talk about a continuum of dialects stretching on the territory which later formed the three Slavic languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. But because the history diverged, we then speak about a separation. On the one hand, a language which was known as Ruthenian, and there have been studies of that Proto-Ruthenian language the Polish, in use in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in late Middle Ages and Renaissance era, on the one hand, and the language of the Muscovite state, the future Russian, on the other. So historically, we first had the separation between Russian on the one side and Ukrainian and Belarusian on the other. And then what happened is when a portion of Ukraine was incorporated into the Muscovite state in the 17th century, we had a situation where a country which was less educationally advanced incorporated a portion of a country which was more educationally advanced. Ukraine had universities, Muscovite state had none. Ukraine had a lot of intellectuals who traveled to the West to receive their education. None of the Muscovite elite at the time, in the middle of the 17th century, have had a chance to do so. So in fact, the Muscovite state used this to its advantage, and there was a brain drain, sometimes by force, sometimes people chose it as a career advancement from Ukraine to the center of the Muscovite state, which started calling itself the Russian Empire since the early 18th century. What happened as a result, we have a period of brief convergence between the two languages, at least as far as written standards are concerned. But already in the 18th century, the use of the Kiev standard of printed books is outlawed for liturgical services in the Orthodox Church in Moscow Patriarchate, and other aspects of language repression begin. Then, in the late 18th, early 19th century, like elsewhere across the Slavic and East European lands, we have a renaissance of discovering language identities, a language based on the actual speech of people as opposed to the learned language of the small elites. So just like in Russia, the time of Karamzin and then Pushkin, we have a development of modern vernacular-based language. Similarly, in Ukraine, this starts in the 1790s with Ivan Kotlяревsky's Aeneida and continues in the Romantic era, and the process is, becomes completely established and irreversible with the arrival of Ukraine's national poet, Taras Shevchenko, whose bicentennial was marked last month. However, within the case of the Russian Empire, the Russian leading ideologues did not care for this revival, and Shevchenko and a lot of his peers were arrested in 1847. and received degrees of various sentences of various degree of harshness. Shevchenko got the harshest one. And then in 1863, we have the famous Valuyev Circular, that is, the Ukrainian language is officially banned for use in the Russian Empire, and the ban is further enhanced in 1875. The Ukrainian language is unbanned in 1905, the ban is reintroduced in 1914, and then in the Soviet period we have a brief time of what historian Terry Martin called the affirmative action empire in the 1920s, when Ukrainian is promulgated, but then again it is reversed. By the time we get to the post-war situation, Ukrainian language is stigmatized as supposedly second-rate and peasant. So if you need prestige and career advancement in Soviet society, the road for that lay through Russia. The situation can be comparable to the so-called white colonies of the United Kingdom. So if you're Irish or Welsh or a Scotsman or Scotswoman, then you need to lose your accent or lose the Gaelic and integrate into English, and then you can blend in. So we do not have the racial difference, but we have the linguistic difference that is stigmatized. Similar situation happens in literature. Ukrainian literature has had several periods of great renaissance in the Romantic era, again in the Modernist era, and most recently in the Postmodernist era, starting in the 80s. However, this renaissance has not received a wide renown beyond the borders of Ukraine. The Ukrainian diaspora around the world did a great job preserving the Ukrainian literary culture for the future generations of Ukrainians, but perhaps we haven't done as good a job making sure that Ukrainian literature is read in translation and appreciated by many cultures around the world. As somebody who is an active translator from Ukrainian to English, I hope to change the situation at least a little bit. Same thing happens with cinema. A lot of us receive our information visually. In the case of Ukraine, we had great cinematic renaissances in the 1920s, and again in the 1960s, early 70s. In both cases, the Renaissance got cut short. In fact, Ukraine is the only case of an actual deliberate destruction of a national cinematic school in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. So there is a long and complicated history of traumas, and we need, as it were, a group therapy for the Ukrainian nation so that we can work through all these traumas and move beyond. And humanities, literary, cultural, linguistics, socio-cultural and socio-linguistic studies help in this group therapy, I hope. And in that sense, I remain optimistic that we will be able to advance forward. Thank you.
You can tell I've set a very difficult task for our speakers. There's some very complex issues. It's difficult to get through everything in just 10 minutes.
May I ask questions meanwhile?
I think we're going to hold questions until the end.
There are a lot of publications concerning Ukrainian events, but it seems that situation is not so clear still. And question that, what do we know about Ukrainian events? First of all, it's necessary to distinguish two things. First is the events that have taken place in Ukraine, and second is the media coverage of these events. The picture of the Ukrainian events depends on what newspapers you read, which kind of TV channels you watch, and which websites you visit. And the real events, they are transformed to interpreted, constructed, or imagined events. Well, I read dozens of articles published in the US newspaper, Russia, Ukraine, and you can see in Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And because of time, I will not touch any samples, concrete samples I mean, and just I will focus on the mainstream tendency in this informational space. Well, first of all, what we can see, observe this polarization of the media space. And when I read newspapers, and not only even articles, scientific articles, very often I see that they are based on the either or principle of the evaluation, positive, negative, true, false, bad guy, good guy, like that. And that kind of thinking, dichotomic thinking, is based on the Aristotle logical laws, law of contradiction and law of the excluded medium. But later Kant, he discovered antinomies. They are conjunctions of the contradictory, but at the same time equally reasoned judgments. And later Hegel, he said that the construction of the theoretical thought is antinomic in its very nature. And modern methodology of science also confirmed that it became clear that there is incompatibility not only between the true and false, but inside the true and falseness themselves. Why I talk about that? Because, and you know, history of the science and the methodological studies, they show that the antinomies, I mean contradictory judgments, this is a legitimate stage in the history of the science as well as social science. Why I talk about that? Because when I read the articles about the Ukrainian crisis, all the time I see the principle of the either-or principle of evaluation. Well, and also question, what is truth? Or truth? Because, you know, dichotomic thinking based on the Aristotle corresponding theory of truth cannot explain the complexity of the political and historical process, including Ukrainian events. But modern methodology has already embraced the idea of relativity and multi-valued logic. It means there is no one truth. One truth somebody has, and he knows what exactly is going on and what is exactly happening in the Ukraine. There could be different answers to the question what is true and what is not, as well as the question what is good and what is bad, as this depends on the system of coordinates, frames of the epistemology, axiology, national interest, security, ethnicity, mega and micro tendencies, law, moral. Now, for example, if you take law and moral, you can see contradiction between them. For example, the true in the law system, when you follow to the law, can be contradict to the concept of the moral justice, which is true in the within frames of the moral discussions. Everybody they claim the objectivity. And the question is that objectivity is something that may wish to obtain, but practically this is almost impossible. It's impossible to have full objective report or research in a separate work. And objectivity implies going beyond group interests and values as well as a narrow methodological paradigm, like positivism or Marxism or something else. While most reports and studies are based on them. When you read the article, you know exactly which kind group he or she belongs to. I mean, which kind interests and which kind values are important for this author. Well, let's remember Hegel, who said that truth is a result taken with its becoming. It means that we must know not only what is, for example, which kind of picture we have, but how we came to this picture, how we came to this or that result. And when I see the many articles, I see there is ideological or political selection of the empirical facts in the adjustment to the political task set. Some articles just ignore inconvenient facts, or there is open falsification. Another thing, express bias. When there are some bad or good guys, it doesn't matter what he talked, what she talked, it doesn't matter. The matter what is important that he is bad already, before we started to discuss about him or her. too wide inductive generalization of the basis of the limited empirical facts. Very often I see one, two facts and very huge generalizations, like global generalization. Wide use of the conclusions by analogy. We know that analogy cannot be proved in terms of strong academic research, but everywhere I see that analogy is used like the means of the proof. Historical justification, the appeal to historical justice, and simplification and vulgarization of the position of political opponent. Well, it's interesting language, terminology too. For example, we can see categoricalness of the judgments, and because dichotomous thinking inevitably generates a corresponding emotional and evaluate language. So also you can say demonization of political opponent, labeling, very expressive language, and substitution of concepts. Well, in the conclusion, I'd like to say that, again, Hegel, the all of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dots. What I mean, that when I look at current reports and current studies, I see very strong dependence of the author on political views, on journalist or editor or owner of the outlet, access to primary sources, financial limits, pressure of current government, current moods in the society, etc. But I guess to understand Ukrainian events, we need some time, because the more time passes after accurate events, the more deeply we can understand them. We need time to collect some materials, to study different, because this is multidimensional phenomena. And if somebody wants to know what is going on and need to have truth, just using only one dimension, it will be wrong. It's very complicated phenomenon. Thank you.
Messing up my, yeah, how do you say that? Let's see, I probably need to, probably need to make this smaller on the screen.
We can get started in high, we'll see if I can fix this. Does that work?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoy talking about international law, and I must say, if there's ever a topic that is filled with topics for international lawyers, this has got to be it. And I think in some ways it's good that I follow Dr. Khan, because he's talking about how do you determine what truth is. And under international law, that's an attempt to, in many ways, take politics out and try to look at things in an objective legal sense, so that you have the best effect for all on a very principled basis. But in fact, what you see is that because of the vagueness of international law, it simply allows everyone to bring their own set of political truths to the table, which is why we have so many disputes. What I want to do is just give you some highlights of the various types of issues that are contained within this whole problem. Basically, I mean, at its most basic level, this has been in the news the last 4 months, a question of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty versus the rights of the people of Crimea to self-determination. We wanted to look at those issues, though. It contains a whole number of other questions. territorial sovereignty. What is the right to self-determination? Very often that depends on who supposedly owns the land, the territory. How do you define what is an armed intervention or UN definition of aggression? Or is it humanitarian intervention? If my students were doing a brief, which they may well be, on a portion of this topic, they may have to get into some treaty interpretations, a variety of treaties that are involved. Also included in several instances are questions as to which laws are superior, domestic laws or international law. And which one, if you have a conflict, which you go by. The United States, for example, has a weird process by which there is a conflict between our national laws and international law. We abide by the one that's the latest passed, which means at times we are guilty of violating international law. So let's look at a couple of these things. Oops. So page, I'm doing what you did. How do you just do page down? This one, that's how I take yeah, just the next page, yeah. I'm gonna do my button for sure. Bear with me. So, a lot of the argument has been over whether or not Russia could legally send troops into Crimea. So the Ukrainians in the West argued that this was a violation of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, that in fact it constituted what we know under international law as armed intervention, which is illegal except in a defensive war, that it met the definition under the UN of aggression, and that in doing so, Russia violated a number of treaties, the ones that I've listed here. There's a lot of controversy, as I'll talk about later, over the Budapest Memorandum and whether or not the Budapest Memorandum is actually a treaty. If you've read news reports, there was a lot of discussion that according to that particular treaty, the United States and England perhaps should have been sending their militaries in to protect the Ukraine. Counter-argument to that, however, is, well, let me maybe go a little, so let's look then at what Russia argues in response to all of these arguments. Her argument is this is not armed intervention because what she is doing is intervening on behalf of Russian nationals, a humanitarian intervention, and arguing that a humanitarian intervention always is better than or is always a supreme reason for a legal intervention. Therefore, it didn't matter if she was violating these treaties because humanitarian intervention trumps everything. Her response to the Budapest Memorandum was that it's not a legally binding treaty, that this was a diplomatic document that was signed a la Helsinki Accords. Helsinki Accords also was not a legally binding document. It's basically an agreement that a lot of states signed that said, we agree to be nice to each other. Also, Putin argued can't be an illegal intervention because the president of Ukraine invited us in. To which, of course, the Ukrainians argued, no, he was not only a criminal, but he left the country. To which the Russians countered, yes, he was deposed illegally. According to your constitution, you should have impeached him. And the Ukrainian parliament just voted that he should leave. Was no longer had any authority. Russia also argued that the newly formed Crimea Regional Authority invited them in, and of course Ukraine responded that that was not a legally constituted governing body because the referendum itself was illegal. So right there you can see we have a number of issues. How do you interpret some of these treaties? Which of these laws do you look as being superior? Or some of these constitutional domestic municipal laws superior to some of the principles under international law? One of the things that countries often do, and the United States is quite well known for this, is to pick and choose, you know, which arguments are the most convenient for us at whichever time. Whoops. So these are the main arguments regarding whether or not it was legal for Russia to send in. So let's look briefly at this right to self-determination because it's something I'll return to a little later as well. What the West and Ukraine argued is that the Crimea did not have a right to hold a referendum and to vote whether or not they wanted to become independent and then to integrate with Russia. Because they argued that according to the Ukrainian constitution, it required the Crimea to come to the Ukrainian parliament and ask for permission to do this. Russia's response is, the right to self-determination is a recognized legal right under international law, and it is not a right that can be dictated by domestic law. They also argued that, wait a minute, the West will recognize the right of Kosovo to become an independent country. So why are you all of a sudden saying that Crimea does not have that same right? To which the West responded, well, in fact, the right to self-determination is only accepted for overseas colonies, called the blue water theory, saltwater theory. Right now, the United Nations has 16 tiny islands on a list of, that it maintains, and under a very strict interpretation of international law, it's only those colonies that have a right to determine if they want to become independent or what they want the future to look like. To the argument that, well, what about Kosovo? We have responded, well, Kosovo was a war situation. And the Albanians within, the Kosovars within Kosovo were very oppressed by the Serbs, hence the war. And not to mention that, for a while Kosovo was under UN administration before it held its own vote. To make the argument there's somewhat difference. Then there's some other additional legal issues. And I just thought I'd mention a little more about the Budapest Memorandum. Another argument that could be made about this, and I don't know if y'all can actually read this, but it says that in Article 1, the 4 signatories agreed to respect the independence, sovereignty, and the existing borders of Ukraine. Russia clearly did not do this. But if you notice, all that does is say, it's a negative right. There's nothing contained in this treaty that would obligate or require the United States or the other signatories to send in a military. The only right that is includes a requirement is Article 4, which says that if a nuclear war is about to break out, then we promise to take it to the United Nations. Because this particular treaty was done in response to the Ukraine being willing to give up their wars. I got really excited. A student in my class said, oh, I just read an article that said, according to the treaty signed between Turkey and Russia, in 1774, it stated that if the Crimea ever became independent, it was to return to the Ottoman Empire and its Turkey as its successor state. I got really excited, started looking for this, and talk about truth. What I found is finally a Turkish author published an article in a Saudi online newspaper arguing this, got the date wrong. If you look at the treaty, it has nothing about this. But nonetheless, it was picked up by virtually every other person making this statement. I'm also somewhat surprised that Russia never brought up whether or not the 1954 decree giving Crimea to Ukraine was legitimate, but they didn't do that one. I think what's really interesting, though, is this whole issue of self-determination. And let me just say, 32 armed conflicts last year. 31 of these were within states. Most of these were ethnic, religiously based. If you think about it, in an era of globalization, what we see is increasingly fragmenting states so that we're having more states. You know, there seems to be this need by people to cling to their national identities. So I think this right of self-determination is something that is going to continue. And it's something that we don't have a good handle on. So let me just raise some questions. So if Russia's arguing that Crimea has a right to determine its own independence, what about the Ukrainians within Crimea? What about the Tatars within Crimea? Do they have a right of self-determination? I'm a little concerned about the West's impact. We may have a situation in the future where we wish we hadn't been so adamant that the Crimea had to ask the Ukrainians for permission. In a few months, Scotland is going to have a referendum on independence from Great Britain. Britain has given its blessing. Catalonia has also slated a vote as to whether or not to become independent. On April 15th, Spain is going to vote whether or not to allow Catalonia to do this, and it's pretty clear they're going to vote no, you can't do this. I'd just like to mention that the Catalonians in September 11th, 2013, joined hands from one end of their country to another, 250 miles of a human chain, as a protest for their independence. The UN, lots of treaties in the UN say all peoples have a right to self-determination. The problem is, how do you define peoples? And as I said, right now, a very conservative interpretation is right now it's only overseas colonies. But clearly, there are other groups that are going to be wanting self-determination. So what kind of factors do we use in deciding whether or not they have a right to self-determination? Do we look at how long they've been there in the country? Do we look at how oppressed they've been? How do we define self-determination? Doesn't seem to, I guess it's really stopping me here, what we're doing anymore. If self-determination is a decision for a group of people to decide how they want to live, does that mean independence? Does it mean autonomy within a country? Does it mean integration within a country? And I think the last question I'll leave you with is, how often does a group of people get to do this? We've argued that in 1954 we gave the Puerto Ricans a right to put together their own constitution. So that should be the end of it. With that, thank you.
Mariya, were you going to speak from there?
I think I'm going to speak from my seat, and I have a mic, so can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. So before I start my very brief presentation, I want to lay out a couple of important caveats. Number one is that I will not and I cannot speak on behalf of the political science, which is a very diverse discipline with a number of subfields. I work in a subfield known as international relations, so I will try to summarize some of the main perspectives on states' behavior in international relations and states' foreign policies. But another caveat is that this summary is going to be somewhat shallow, superficial. It's going to be lacking nuances and complexities of those theoretical arguments. And the last caveat is that I do not necessarily side with the perspectives that I'm going to be talking about. And if you want to learn where I stand on the issue, I can talk about it in the Q&A. Okay? So in the interest of time, and understanding the oversimplification of the following typology, I would divide all international relations perspectives on foreign policies and states' conduct in international politics into two big groups. One group emphasizes the impact of material factors, access to nuclear weapons, military might, economic strength, etc. And another group, they emphasize ideational factors such as strengths of identity, norms, law, treaties, etc. So a prime candidate for the materialist outlook on international relations is the theory known as political realism. And it's very, very popular because the majority of states in international politics are guided by the principles of political realism, including the United States foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy. In a summary, political realists argue that states' conduct occur in an anarchical environment. So world politics is an anarchy, meaning that there is no world government, there is no world police, there is no law enforcement forces that will protect interests of individual states, right? So if there is no one to protect interests of individual states, states are left to rely on their own power. So every state is therefore interested in maximizing power resources because otherwise they're not going to be able to pursue their national interests. And although states can pursue a variety of national interests, it's assumed that security is always going to be paramount. But security is a scarce resource, and states find themselves in the competition for power and influence with the other states to maximize their chances for survival or being able to pursue their interests. So states said to have mutually incompatible interests, and the differences in states' behavior and their ability to do what they would like to do is determined by their relative power position, how much power, how much might they have vis-a-vis other states. So in this conception, if you want to understand Russian foreign policy in general and with regard to the Ukrainian territory in particular, so Russian foreign policy conduct has been shaped by the Russian relations with the powerful states, especially the United States, whose global hegemony the Russian government has long resisted, but in the past it has been constrained militarily as well as economically to defy it. So if we look at Russia's conduct through the lens of political realism, its decision to annex Crimea, for example, followed its desire to contain and balance the United States. And if we look at the speech, at the content of the speech that President Putin delivered to the Congress, preceding the introduction of the draft law on the annexation of Crimea, President Putin condemned the infamous policy of containment, I quote him, that has been used by the West against Russia over centuries and continues today. He asserted Russia's own national interests that need to be taken into account and respected, but he also acknowledged that in the past, Russia had been in no position to pursue its national aims. And so he mentioned, with regard to Crimea, for example, he said that in 1991, Russia had to humbly accept the situation as it was going through such hard times that realistically it wasn't capable of protecting its interests. And so indeed, if we look at what was happening in international relations or bilateral relations of Russia and the United States throughout the 2000s, well, there were a series of events that highlighted weaknesses of Russia and its inaptitude to resist and contain American unilateralism. So, for example, at the beginning of Putin's first presidency in 2000, the Bush administration made a unilateral decision to abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. It's a huge blow to Russia's perception of its might. Even before the commencement of the military operation in Iraq, the US military bombed anti-aircraft installations in Iraq, threatening Russia's business interests in Iraqi lucrative oil sector. And then in 2004, you all know that 3 Baltic states, backed by the United States, became members of NATO. And 2 Russian neighbors, Georgia and Ukraine, which had long sought to escape political influence of the Kremlin, witnessed the transfer of their domestic power to pro-Western leaning forces. And so Washington's backing was indispensable to these transformations, as well as to the wave of demonstration that became known as Arab Spring, and Putin dubbed it as Arab Winter. So on this background, it was particularly important for the Kremlin leadership to demonstrate the continued relevance of Russia in the world affairs and its ability to act and defend its national interests. So in this, Russia's foreign policy toward Ukraine conforms the realist expectations. Okay? So that's kind of one take. And by the way, in realist conception of world politics, there are no morals or ethics. You know, yeah, it's immoral, it's unethical, it's not consistent with the precepts of law, but national interests are defined in terms of power, and ethics and morals should be left to interpersonal relations or domestic politics, but they should not be viewed as guiding principles of international, of states' foreign policy conduct. So now, as I said, another group of perspectives direct our attention to the problem of developing Russia's new post-Soviet identity, the role of culture, the role of historical interpretation in foreign policy. And indeed, the conflicting identity of the Russian Federation. Is Russia a Western state? Is it a unique civilization or something in between? Also, the lack of broad acceptance of its Western image at home and non-recognition of its Western status by many states abroad has affected Russian foreign policy conduct, especially its defiance of what it perceives as Western notions of human rights and democracy and democratization. And when we apply this to the situation in Crimea, Russia's foreign policy has demonstrated both an emulation and rejoinder to what Russia perceives as American exceptionalism, an assertion of Russia's own unique civilization. So, in a way, Russia countered what Putin called America's exclusivity and exceptionalism with its own exceptionalism by restoring unity of people and place through the annexation of Crimea. Furthermore, since his return to the presidency in 2012, Vladimir Putin has made repeated appeals to Russia's unique civilization, antithetical to the West. Okay? Again, it's just 2 very brief, very broad, very general summaries of ways of understanding Russian foreign policy conduct in Crimea. And I don't necessarily side with the 2. In my research, I use a more nuanced and more complex critical geopolitics perspective on Russian foreign policy conduct, which analyzes Russia's own unique geopolitics code. But to me, Moscow's relations with Ukraine have become something of a hallmark of this new Russian geopolitical logic. Despite the evident opportunism in what Russia does, Russia has so far been able to get what it wants on this dimension of its foreign policy. It has been able to annex the Crimea without alienating completely its important allies, China and Ukraine. Yeah, it's not really concerned anymore with the West because it has felt that it has been excluded from the West for a long time. So yeah, it has been able to get what it wants with regard to Crimea and Ukraine without alienating China and India. Its veto power in the United Nations Security Council protects it from the automatic threat of sanctions, while the ones that have been imposed by Europe and the US are viewed as a continuation of their policies toward Russia by other means. So in the same speech that I just cited, Putin lists a number of sanctions that have been left behind since the Cold War era, and according to the government, it's like what else can you impose on us? What else? What's new? So the sanctions that have been already imposed are not viewed as really having the keys for changing the direction of Russian foreign policy. Then Russia learned a lesson from its 2008 war with Georgia that West will fall short of using military force. And while it initially uses loud condemnations and threats, those will wane over time. The annexation of Crimea was very much worth the gamble for Russia, as it has prevented the US from gaining greater footing in the post-Soviet territory and returned a strategically important land under Russia's control. All in all, it has become a test and a symbol of Russia's strategic independence in its foreign policy and its ability to stand up to Western and other international pressures, something it has aspired to accomplish for a very, very long time. Okay? And I know it's something that, not that much discussed in the mainstream media, and I know it probably, provoked lots of questions I will be happy to address in the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it short and